everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Grab those reading glasses because it's time to do another exciting episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read chapter 14 of My Life in the Eagles by Don Felder. This chapter takes place right after the Eagles broke up in 1980. Chapter 14 is called Family. Here we go. The news came like a slap in the face out of nowhere. Although we had not been getting along for some time, I never thought we'd split. There was too much at stake. The emotional shock was such that I couldn't even think straight for a moment. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, and my legs virtually collapsed under me. My initial reaction was, my God, what's going to happen now? This seemed like the end of the only life I had known. We had had breakups before, and there was usually some sort of problem between two or all of us, especially by the end of the tour, but this was different. This was serious. Glenn Frey had called time. He told one reporter later, I knew the Eagles were over about halfway through the Long Run album. I told myself I'd never go through this again. I could give you 30 reasons why, but let me be concise. I started the band, I got sick of it, and I quit. Don admitted he'd probably peaked on Hotel California. After that, we started growing apart as collaborators and friends. We put everything we had into it at the expense of our health, friendships, and everything else. I spent several broken nights worrying that I might have been the sole cause of the split, but I learned much later what had gone down in Miami. There was so much outside pressure from the record label, the critics, and the public to produce high-quality work and surpass the previous album every time that Don and Glenn simply couldn't handle it. Don was the gifted writer and the perfectionist. He'd criticized the work Glenn submitted and asked for slight revisions. Glenn finally announced he was quitting to do a solo album. Irving called us all up and told us we each had to finish editing the live album without Glenn. I guess he of all people had seen it coming for years. Everyone except Glenn flew to Bill's Seismic studio in Miami and started fixing guitar parts, background vocals, drum parts, and bass. Then we flew the tapes to LA where Glenn and Bill's assistant in another studio fixed his parts, then FedExed the tapes back to Miami. There we were, a continent of resentment and unhappiness between us, recording on opposite coasts, entirely separate from each other. Glenn wouldn't talk directly to anybody in the band, but was yelling and screaming at everyone else. Finally, he fired Irving, hired his own manager, and withdrew completely. Everybody kept hoping Glenn would reconsider, even me. We thought he'd get the stress out of his system, do a solo album, and be back. We were at the peak of our success, the biggest band in the world. Why quit now? Yes, it had often been Yes, he and Don and I often rubbed each other the wrong way, but what else was there? Could there be life after the Eagles? The record label refused to make any announcement to the fans, trying to keep the hope alive. They spoke vaguely of solo albums, rest periods, and studio work. Joe Smith believed that 2 new songs would sell more copies of the proposed album Eagles Live. He offered us $2 million for the new songs, but Glenn still refused to work with the rest of us. Eagles Live, featuring the best from our gigs in Santa Monica, arrived in stores on November 7, 1980, reached number 6 on the charts, and sold over 1 million copies. Our live cover of Seven Bridges Road, the harmonica a cappella song we used to sing together in the shower room before each gig, has a unifying theme, but which, tellingly, we hadn't sung in years, reached number 27 on the singles chart. On the liner notes, the album carried a picture of an eagle's nest with 4 eggs in it and a grenade. Someone had pulled the pin on the grenade. As far as our fans knew, the Eagles simply vanished. The 1980s heralded a rock scene that relied largely on synthesizers and drum machines. After the assassination of John Lennon in December 1980, it felt like the end of an era for all of us. The music business was something we no longer recognized or felt a part of. Blondie was riding high in the charts, along with people like The Police, ABBA, David Bowie, and Michael Jackson. Irving, who realized his best-selling act was no longer going to make him millions, became head of MCA Records, dropping all but 5 of the company's almost 50 rock acts, and thereby rescuing it from bankruptcy. The move made him one of the most powerful men in the music industry, yet didn't prevent his retaining indirect control of frontline management or his own independent record label, Full Moon. Joe Smith, head of Warner and the last connection between Warner and the Eagles, resigned. The only headlines the rest of us were making were unwelcome ones. Don Henley threw a party at his LA home in which a minor took an overdose of drugs. The paramedics had to be called and the 16-year-old girl resuscitated. Don was arrested and charged with possession of marijuana, cocaine, and quaaludes, as well as contributing to the delinquency of a minor. He claimed he never even knew she was there among all the other groupies and partygoers. He was fined $2,000, placed on probation for 2 years, and ordered to attend drug counseling. Later that same year, he and his actress girlfriend were involved in a plane crash in Aspen. Glenn did some film work in Mexico and ended up detained by authorities briefly in Veracruz after a minor car accident. He was so freaked out by the experience that he chartered a private plane to fly home to Aspen, Colorado as soon as he was released. Joe and Tim were out on the road or doing solo work, and I was home trying to make some sense of my family life. The year the Eagles broke up turned out to be one of my worst personally, too. For a time, I felt as if my whole world was falling apart. The day before the long-run tour ended and I was due home, Susan opened a fan letter from among scores that had been delivered to our Malibu house by the management company. Sacks of mail were collected together and held back until our return, then delivered to each member of the band personally. Susan rarely bothered to read the letters and cards adoring fans sent, but for some reason, this time, she did. My mother was staying with her, awaiting my return as well, when Susan happened upon a letter from a fan in Texas. This particular fan was the most sexually adventurous creature I had ever met. During our brief license on the road in a hotel room in Dallas, she had led me through experiences I had never previously known. In her letter, she expressed her delight at our wonderful night together and cataloged some of the things she'd like to do to me if I was ever in Texas again. Poor Susan, who had always chosen to ignore the rumors and media stories about the excesses of life on the road, found herself sitting in her own living room, her mother-in-law a few feet away, reading a sexually explicit billet doux from a woman I had had sex with. This was irrefutable evidence in black and white, held in her trembling hand. When I arrived home the following day, expecting my usual warm greeting, I found myself ducking under a machete. She wanted to decapitate me. Slowly. To her eternal credit, she did a brilliant job of publicly pretending everything was normal for my mother's sake and that of the children, but when we were alone, she talked to me endlessly about what I had done and why. "I can't believe you'd be so stupid to jeopardize everything we have for this!" She waved the letter accusingly at me. 9 years we've been together. 9 years. We have 3 small children. What were you thinking? There was nothing I could say to appease her. I had been caught red-handed, and I knew it. All the years of guilt and anger conspired against me. I managed to persuade myself that none of the women mattered, that my infidelities were insignificant compared with the depth of feeling I had for Susan. But the pain I saw in her eyes made me realize how wrong I had been. "I honestly never set out to hurt you, but you must have known what was going on," I said lamely. "I was thrown in with Dawn and Glenn and Joe, with all that alcohol and drugs. You couldn't possibly have expected me not to crack after all these years." Even as I spoke the words, I knew how shallow they sounded. Whether she'd suspected or not before didn't matter. The letter she held in her hand made our situation temporarily irredeemable. We started therapy as a couple and separately, and I came to realize just how much distress I had caused. I also realized how close I was to blowing my marriage. I had almost lost her before when we had separated in the 60s, and my good fortune of finding her again in Boston after Flo had always been such a blessing. I knew then, as I knew now, that she was the only woman I had ever truly loved, and the thought of losing her snatched the breath from my lungs. It may have been a little late, but I decided there and then that I had done all I needed to do in terms of exploring sexual experiences with other women. The breakup of the Eagles had made me realize that what really meant the most to me in my life wasn't the band, it was Susan and the kids. I would do everything within my power to keep them. My heinous crime wasn't a bear I could fully wrestle to the mat and forget. However, Susan might be able to forgive me eventually, but she could never forget. I'd created a fissure in our relationship that would reside there permanently, irreparably. Even though I tried my hardest by apologizing profusely and telling her how much I loved and admired her and promising never to touch anyone else, the bear was always there between us. In therapy, I became dogged with guilt, which I found impossible to purge. I had been racked with it enough on the road, but this was in a different league. This was true remorse. I begged forgiveness both from Susan and from a higher being for the sins I had committed, the damage and suffering I'd caused not only to my family, but to all those women I had used and abused. A great many other beasts were awoken by the therapy, as they so often are. One was the issue of control. Because I was away so much, Susan had understandably assumed control of the house and the kids and the Mexican maids and our 3 pet dogs. It was she who chose and bought the furniture and the drapes, disciplined the children, and decided where they should go to school and how they should dress. When I came home and tried to impose a different regime or make a suggestion about something she might like to consider, my input was largely ignored or overlooked. The kids knew that when Dad was home, things were suddenly more ordered, but as soon as I was gone, they could all relax and go back to their normal lives. The effect had been to make me feel less and less involved in family life and more on the periphery, which our therapist explained had helped push me into the arms of other women. Don needs to feel a part of his family in this home, she told Susan. He needs to feel that the little authority he does have isn't constantly undermined. Until he does, he'll never be able to come to terms with the 2 very separate parts of his life. Or worse, he'll start to feel more comfortable with the on-the-road persona than he does with the home one, and you may lose him altogether. The therapist made a lot of sense, although she still made me feel like a complete failure as a husband and father. She also made me realize too late that being a rock star wasn't a horrible thing to be. I had learned to cope with the negatives and savor the positives, like the money and the fame and the ability to play music. There was a thrilling element to my life that allowed me to walk out onto a stage in front of tens of thousands of screaming fans and do my stuff. But when I came home and wanted real intimacy, to counter the increasing isolation I felt on the road, despite or perhaps because of the women I'd slept with, I was faced instead with control issues and distancing between Susan and me that only fed my guilt. Often she made me admit it was a relief to go back out on tour, to a life that was more familiar and easier to deal with. If I could have turned back the clock and been a better person, then I would have done so. Susan, Jessie, Rebecca, and Cody were my life, and there was, I knew, a very real danger that I might lose them. And for what? To satisfy the carnal beast? To impress my fellow band members and not be regarded by them with suspicion and contempt? I prayed for extra strength to help me through the many trials I was now facing. Was this how I was going to end up? An embittered, unemployed guitarist, divorced from my wife, a weekend dad living in some apartment alone somewhere? I prayed not. Perhaps not surprisingly, within 6 months of the band splitting up and the start of my problems with Susan, I was hospitalized with chronic diverticulitis, inflammation of the colon, which erupted within me like a burning spear. I had been trying to deal with the stress of my life in a very self-healing way, but internally my body was eating itself alive. I spent a week in the Santa Monica hospital on intravenous antibiotics, feeling utterly wretched about myself and the path my life seemed to be taking. A nurse brought me a telephone one afternoon. "Feldner, it's Irving," the voice on the line said. I was touched at the thought of Irving calling to see how I was. I should have known better. "Just to let you know," he said, without asking a single question about my well-being, "Joe Walsh is putting together a solo album, and he has recorded one of the songs she wrote for the last album which didn't make it. It was the one called 'You're Really High, Aren't You?' He's going to redo the lyrics and change it around a bit, and would like your permission to use it on his new album." Irv, I was kind of keeping that one for the future," I said, at a loss for what to say, my head flopping back onto the pillow with a searing wave of pain. I felt as though he wasn't asking me, he was telling me, as Joe's manager, that this was how it was going to be. I think I was supposed to be grateful. I had always been careful about spending money. When you come from poverty, you never quite believe your luck will last. In LA, I saw plenty of other people make mistakes. They'd join bands, have some success, and make lots of money. 10 years later, they'd be subsisting in run-down little condominiums in the valley because they had blown it all. I was somewhat aware of this danger. I also had a good business manager who had invested in some profitable real estate ventures for me, but I was still only in my 30s, and none of my investments had yet left me financially solvent for the rest of my days. With the lucrative income from touring cut off, a future living on royalties alone would obviously have a big impact on my family and me. I had enough to live on, but if I wanted to maintain our lifestyle, I would definitely have to reconsider my options. I bought a big house on a 2-acre lot in Bonsall Canyon, Malibu, from Tommy Chong of the comedy duo Cheech and Chong, both of whom became close friends. My immediate neighbors were Jimmy Pankow from the band Chicago on one side and the actor Nick Nolte on the other. Nick used to have such wild parties with Gary Busey and his friends that Jimmy would call me up in the middle of the night and say, "Hey, Feldner, turn that music down." And I'd yell back, "It's not me, it's Nolte." Jimmy was a great family man, living high on the hog with 7 acres filled with thoroughbred horses and Rolls Royces. He was always inviting me over for barbecues with his friends, most of whom were his fellow band members. I can remember watching them all getting along so well, their wives and kids in tow, and wishing our band had been like that. Our house was a California-style property designed by the man who built the Disneyland Hotel. It had a living room 40 square feet that was like a hotel lobby. Irving had recommended his architecture and interior designer to us, and Susan met with them and decided what we wanted, which was effectively a whole new house on the back of this living room, so we had to move into rental houses until it was done. When the band split up and I came home to live in the remodeled house, I just didn't feel comfortable. There was far too much marble and granite for me. It felt more than a little gauche. I had come from meager means, and my new home seemed opulent and pretentious. I was quite frankly embarrassed by it. Worst of all, I felt I had been completely omitted from the planning. Everything seemed very feminine, and there wasn't even a corner for me to have a comfortable recliner to feel at home. I discussed it with Susan, and we eventually agreed that there was no point in my feeling uncomfortable in my own home. So we sold the house and bought a 5-acre piece of land at Paradise Cove, for which I started designing a new home. To supplement my income and stop myself from going mad, I went back to school and acquired the qualifications I needed for a real estate license to broker my own property transactions. I hoped that by doing that and trying my hand at a few different jobs such as writing movie scores or doing some TV work, I could finally get to stay home with my wife and kids after years on the road. For the first few years of their lives, my kids had grown up with an absentee father. I'd come home and they'd look at me and say, "Oh yeah, you live here, don't you? You sleep with Mom. I remember you." I'd be there for a week or two, then go. I missed school plays, parent evenings, soccer games, and many of the major events in their young lives. Okay, I was Santa Claus each time I came home, laden with gifts and toys, my plunders from the big wide world, but it wasn't the same. Our grueling schedule prevented me from being an active participant in their development, despite all the astronomically expensive telephone calls. Poor Susan was effectively a single parent. Now all that was going to change. I refused point blank to go back out on the road, even when friends in the industry offered me a chance to tour with them. I was enjoying time with my kids again. I'd get up at 6 o'clock in the morning and make strawberry pancakes for breakfast, each one with their initials cooked into the batter. I drove my kids and their friends to school in the carpool. I became the Little League and soccer coach. Jesse was wild about technology and computers and building things like remote-control cars and gliders, so I encouraged him to follow his passion. Warner Brothers gave us one of the first Atari computers, and he and I played a game called Lemonade Stand on it, which you had to decide how many lemons and how much sugar to buy to make lemonade, depending on the weather predictions for the next few days. Man, he loved that. Later, I bought him Millionaire, a stock market game in which he built up his own imaginary portfolio. I took him to the New York Stock Exchange to see how it worked firsthand. He even appeared in People magazine at America's first computer camp when he was 8 years old. With his white blonde hair, he looked like the kid from The Champ. I could have called him Cotton. When he was 10 years old, he came to me and asked me to teach him how to play guitar. At first, I discouraged him and refused, using reverse psychology to make him want it even more. He'd begged me to teach him a few licks until finally I'd relent, but only after I made him listen to B.B. King and Eric Clapton and Duane Allman. I knew Duane Allman, I'd tell him. It was he who taught me how to play slide, and I once shook B.B. King's hand. "Really, Dad?" he said, not sure whether to believe me or not. Then he'd go up to his room and practice for hours, cranking it up on his own, but never in public. He was far too shy. I spoiled all the kids rotten, and they were constantly complaining that I was too affectionate with them in public. I guess I was trying to compensate for the lack of physical affection my parents had shown me. Whereas I had had very few birthday parties, they had massive catered events with balloons and clowns and musicians. Christmases involved the biggest tree with me dressing up as Santa and dishing out gifts like huge-scale train sets or rocking horses. It was a million miles from my Christmases in Florida, with 2 small gifts under the tree for Jerry and me, usually much-needed items of clothing or shoes, and the crafts for Mom and Dad that we'd made at school. or from my first Christmas in that first floor apartment in Culver City with Susan and Kilo, where we had made a star out of tinfoil and cut pictures from magazines to decorate our skinny little tree. I don't think my kids really understood that their father was a rock star. To them, I was just dad. I played guitar and was away a lot. The only thing that made me stand out from the crowd was the way I looked with my shoulder-length hair, beard, and mustache. One day when I had just dropped Rebecca off at school and was walking her to her class, I overheard one of her friends, who had previously only seen me from the back, cry, "Rebecca, your mom's got a beard!" Maybe my dad was right. Maybe it was time to shave. When Don Henley invited me on the road with him for his first solo tour, I turned him down. Not only did I not want to tour again, but the salary he offered was $5,000 a week. That of a sideman, not a band member or the lead guitarist of the Eagles. He made the offer through Irving instead of calling me direct, and I wrote and told him that I wasn't really interested, despite my enormous respect for him as a singer and songwriter. His letter of reply said, "I don't see any reason why we can't write together and remain in touch." And so, we did. I'd send him tapes now and then, and he came and sang on a few records for me, but he was writing with Danny Korchmer and other people he felt were fresh and new. He was enjoying heading in a different direction, and that was cool. Instead of going on the road, I concentrated on the completion of our new home, in between writing and performing some songs for film, including the soundtrack for an animated movie called Heavy Metal. I also wrote the title theme song and sound score for an animated Saturday morning CBS series my kids love called Galaxy High. I did another song called Wildlife, which became the title track for a Neil Simon movie called The Slugger's Wife, and I contributed some music for a film called Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I love that movie. Written by none other than the little Cameron Crowe, the Rolling Stone reporter who had been on the road with us. I did some session work for people like Stevie Nicks, Bob Seger, Warren Zevon, Boz Scaggs, and the Bees Gees, and I helped my friends Chicago out a couple times when their guitarist Donnie Dacus left them. I worked on an album by Mickey Thomas of Jefferson Starship, which saw me back working with the inimitable Bill Seismic, and I helped Joe Walsh with his solo records. I even ended up co-hosting a music video program for kids called Fun TV, or FTV. My kids loved it. They were much more impressed with that than anything I had done with the Eagles. The record company waited 2 years before they officially confirmed the Eagles had split, and in May 1982, shortly after the announcement, Glenn released his first solo album, No Fun Allowed, more than half of which was co-written with Jack Timpchin, his collaborator on one of the band's first hits, Peaceful Easy Feeling. Glenn swapped his trademark long hair and handlebar mustache for a clean look, and the distinctive Eagles sound for his Detroit rhythm and blues roots. No Fun Allowed sold around 500,000 copies. Don Henley, meanwhile, was in the midst of his nationwide tour when his hit single Dirty Laundry climbed to number 3 and helped his album I Can't Stand Still sell around 700,000 copies. The trouble was that after years of keeping our names out of the newspaper and our faces off Eagle album covers in favor of the artist Boyd Elder's incredible decorative cattle skulls, no one really knew who Don Henley and Glenn Frey were, or any of us for that matter. For years we had been able to walk around L.A., into restaurants, clubs, and theaters, and melt anonymously into the crowd. It is one of the great bonuses of being an Eagle. No one knows what we look like. Furthermore, Don and Glenn were now competing in the charts against the Eagles' Greatest Hits Volume 2, released by Asylum/Elektra, in time for the 1982 Christmas market, cobbled together from Hotel California and The Long Run. Despite its lack of direct involvement with the band, it far outsold both solo albums. It was a hard act to follow. When asked if the Eagles would ever reunite, Don famously replies, "Yeah, sure, when hell freezes over." My mother, who was leading a full and busy life in Gainesville, remarried in 1982, having met her new husband, Oliver Reynolds, through the church. She finally moved out of the house I had grown up in and into Oliver's concrete block property with a yard closer to her sister. The old house remained in the family. My father's younger sister moved in. Once again, I paid for that old house to be completely remodeled and refurbished. My mother rejected my offer of a Hawaiian honeymoon as a wedding present and asked for a small check instead. She remained as active as ever, although she finally gave up work when she remarried, spending her time taking bus trips with Oliver instead. They traveled quite a bit and enjoyed church outings until Ollie developed Alzheimer's and my mother became his full-time caregiver. Even then, she wouldn't accept help. Jerry and I paid for someone to come in 3 days a week to cook, leave food in the refrigerator and do the heavy cleaning. But she lasted less than 2 weeks before my mother told her to get out and not come back. She didn't do things the way I liked them, Mother explained. The same year she and Ollie were married, David Blue, whose career had nosedived in the years since I had stopped playing with him, dropped dead while jogging in New York. He was 40 years old. I didn't hear about it until some time later, but the news was shocking. He and I had been contemporaries out on the road together, and now his life was over. I couldn't help thinking about the time we had spent together snorting cocaine, smoking pot, and taking Valium, and I wondered if that had anything to do with his sudden demise. The loss only made me think longer and harder about what I was doing with my life and made me work even harder to keep my marriage going. In November 1982, our fourth child, Leah, was born. With this birth, we felt we had come full circle from that sad time. Our family was complete. We had survived the traumas I had wreaked upon us, and we had a new baby to concentrate on. I'd lie in bed early in the morning, Leah's still warm weight upon my chest, and pray silently to the Lord to thank Him for the blessings I had been given. What had started as a dreadful beginning to the new decade was suddenly looking brighter. I wondered what the next few years would bring. With Glenn and Don embarking on solo careers and Joe and Timothy talking about doing a record each, I decided I might as well give it a try, as long as I didn't have to do any extensive touring. I had had enough of walking around on eggshells and not saying what I really felt about songs and lyrics. I just wanted to do what I wanted to do and not be a slave to someone else's agenda. As an inducement for the last Eagles album, Elektra/Asylum had offered each of us a record deal, so I decided to take up the offer. My budget was around $300,000, which wasn't huge, so I converted my guest house into a full-blown recording studio, a drum room, a 24-track, and a piano. That way I wouldn't have to be looking over my shoulder all the time, or worrying about spiraling studio costs of around $20,000 a week. With time on my side, I'd be able to experiment. If I didn't like something, I could redo it. The only other person in the studio was an engineer I hired to record the music while I played. I had scores of tracks I had written for the Eagles, which had never been used. Unearthing them, I chose the best and worked on them, endlessly reshaping the original sound. I called the new album Airborne, to signify that this eagle wasn't grounded, and worked on it for over a year. I invited friends like Jimmy Pankow and Lee Longnane of Chicago, Dave Mason of Fleetwood Mac and Traffic, Kenny Loggins and Timothy B. Smith to provide backup music and vocals, along with a bunch of buddies from the business. I played all the guitars, sang all the lead and most of the backup vocals, and played some synthesizer. We had a lot of fun together in the studio, and I enjoyed every minute of working with such outstanding talent. Cody, who was about 4 years old and absolutely fearless, would often come into the studio to sneak up on me. "Hey, buddy," I'd say as I saw his mop of white Feldner hair bob up and down past the studio window. "Want to come in and listen to what Daddy's doing?" He'd sit on my lap, smiling at me, gap-toothed, listening to the music I was making. It was sheer delight to spend such time with the children. These were simple pleasures I had been denied for so long. With the album nearly ready, I was painfully aware of the comparisons that would undoubtedly be drawn with the Eagles. One song was called Still Alive, a comment on my journey through life with the Eagles and my relationship with Susan. Another song called Night Owl was about the lightless rock and roll lifestyle, living in the darkness and going to bed when the sun comes up, a statement on the slithering, intoxicated nights we were allowed to devour us. A song called Bad Girls with a couple of great double guitar parts was a track I had originally offered to the Eagles for the long run. Joe and I had come up with it in one all-night drinking session. It was previously entitled Wild Turkey. I finished it for this album and wrote a different lyric. My favorite was a number called Who Tonight on the theme of fidelity. It was not unlike that timeless song from Stephen Stills, Love the One You're With. The trouble was, I still had serious inhibitions about my voice. I mixed my voice down so low that you had to strain to even hear it above my guitar playing. For years, I had been browbeaten into believing that my voice was mediocre at best. When it was time for me to step up to the mic for my own album, my self-confidence was a bludgeon bleeding thing, and it showed. I remember Joe Walsh telling me once how hard it was to be a solo artist because you had to do everything yourself, and I suddenly understood what he meant. Even at the lowest moments of the Eagles, we always had each other as sounding boards, even if it was just a sound off. Our biggest arguments were over the music and trying to get it right. Now I felt stuck out on a limb with no one to ask how I was doing. There was no Don or Bill to ask, "Hey, what do you think of this one?" It felt horrible to be so alone. While I plodded on doing my own stuff, everything was changing at the label. The likes of the Eagles, Joni Mitchell, Jackson Browne, and Linda Ronstadt were no longer vital to the organization, which had been completely restructured. Asylum had done a 180-degree shift, and its new direction was in black R&B acts. By 1983, Michael Jackson was the undisputed king of the charts with songs like Billie Jean from his best-selling album Thriller. Hee hee. I eventually delivered Airborne to the company that had no interest in it, and it even closed its offices in Los Angeles, relocating to New York. I was just relieved and happy to have finished the album, which had taken all my strength. I turned it in and thought, if it sells, that's great. If it doesn't sell, it doesn't really matter, which was just as well. I had a whole new relaxed attitude to life, and so, I think, did the rest of the band. It had been an incredibly hard work being an Eagle, and until we stopped, we didn't realize how hard it was. Being an Eagle was burdensome. The stress and pressure of writing, recording, and touring, the media and the fan frenzy. When that machine gears up, it was a loud roar. It takes a lot out of you to get up every day, put on your Eagle suit, and have every note or word you write put under a microscope by other band members or critics. It's oppressive. Now we were free of all that, and it felt good to be home with our families, writing and recording the music we liked, having a few beers, doing our own stuff, playing with our kids, and being ourselves. The magnitude of what we had become had torn us apart. It wasn't just Glenn. We had all been ready to run from the machine. Well, that's the end of Chapter 14. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 14 in the comments. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.